middle of the show either.
Too late.
Welcome to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. I'm your host, Montoya Smith, a.k.a. Black Socrates, and we are proud to be doing our first Facebook Live talk show. So most of y'all, if you tuned into, you're a regular listener to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. Y'all know we are typically on the blog talk radio format, but we are fortunate enough to be in Mango's Caribbean Restaurant. I want to go ahead and shout out the owner, Matthew True. Their brother's known for letting us come into his restaurant to do our first Facebook Live event. Go ahead and introduce you to my co-host on the other end here, Christy Gaynell. So for some of you, it should be your first time actually seeing her on the show. And if you don't know me and you from outside the state, it's your first time seeing me on radio as well. We're also pleased to have in a special guest for this morning's topic. If you've seen the Facebook promotions, we are doing mental illness and the black community. What's so bad about it? And we are fortunate enough to have an expert, as I always do, try to bring on people who are a little smarter than myself to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. Dr. Monica Hill, if you will, thank you for being with us this morning. If we can get you on the mic here and give a little bit of your background for this morning's discussion question on mental illness and the black community. Thank you again for coming on, Dr. Hill.
Good morning. Actually very excited to be here. These are two areas that I'm probably extremely passionate about, which is mental health and African American population. So I'm excited to be here. I have been a mental health professional for 17 years, and I love it. I love what I do. I do it because I love it, not because it's a business for me or a moneymaker. And I'm excited about the fact that we're having this topic today, because I think one of the things we really want to do is to erase the stigma that mental health means crazy, because it does not. It means mentally healthy, and I think that's what we all should be striving for.
I've never heard that term before, mentally healthy. So you telling me Kanye's not crazy, Dr. Hill?
We don't use crazy.
Y'all don't use crazy in the profession.
Mentally unhealthy, but we don't use crazy.
Okay, so I want to, in the end of these 2 hours, I want to see if you can convince me to stop using the word crazy.
Right. So let's just start with that. If you think about your biological health, if something goes wrong in your biology, in your physical body, do you say it's crazy?
No.
Right? So we have to start kind of paralleling mental health to biological health. If something
Sometimes I
hurts
say
and
my
aches-
body feels crazy.
Yep. It could feel crazy, but you don't call it crazy. Yeah, and it's a struggle.
Acting
It's
crazy,
a struggle.
Though. It be acting crazy sometimes. Like
Yeah.
inside, I'd be like, oh my God, my stomach is acting crazy right now. Is that
But what is the key? The key is you try to figure out what's wrong,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
You don't leave it unattended. If it's acting crazy, something's, stomach is churning, acting crazy, your first goal is what is going on. So that's the thing with mental health. When it starts acting a little crazy, our first goal should be what's happening with me.
So, Christy, I'm going to ask you, it makes sense, Dr. Hill, and like I said, maybe at the end of the show I'll stop using that term, and I'm kind of joking, I don't use that term a lot, but of course, I'm not, and Christy's the same way, so we'll see where she's at with it, but in the last couple of weeks, we were planning on doing this show. I reached out to you actually about a month ago, so just for anybody out there watching, we're not doing this show on the heel of Kanye on purpose, in the sense that we were trying to do this a month ago. And it just so happened we were able to time this thing out to where there's an episode, obviously, with someone famous in our community in particular. And so, Christy, I know you don't watch TV, as I don't, but I just wanted to see any thoughts about, have you kept up anything with going on? Because that's what everybody's talking about on social media. Everybody's talking about what's going on with Kanye. So it's almost like the perfect opportunity to bring this topic to forum, because it's trending. Mm-hmm. It's an issue that we need to be talking about anyway. Should have been talking about again. We had planned to do this a month ago and just wasn't able to do it. But any thoughts on what's trending? Have you had any conversations or any thoughts about the situation with Kanye? And like I said, from the standpoint of, again, I know you like me. You don't watch TV. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot as far as knowing exactly what happened with Kanye, but just the idea, have you seen anything trending with that, or any thoughts on the situation?
I've seen Kanye on various shows, talk shows, and award shows and stuff. And my first thought when I saw him is something's off with Kanye. Like, there's something going on there, and everybody's ignoring it. And I kept wondering why people were ignoring it. And then all of a sudden, he's hospitalized. But to be honest, when you first brought this show to me and we were talking about doing it, Kanye wasn't my go-to per se. The interesting thing, and I've been just debating on whether or not I was going to even bring this up on the program, but my brother was recently Baker acted and put into a hospital for mental health issues. So this show for me is much closer to home and to the heart than Kanye.
No, I absolutely respect that. And the reality is, like as I said, we were planning on doing this show before this in a sense, this episode or whatever you want to call the situation with Kanye. The reality is what you just said, Christy, is this hits home for me as well. And the reality is, if we're honest, it hits home for a lot of people in our community. And, we can look at and, maybe deflect, because that seems to be a part of what goes on when it comes to, as you said, mentally healthy. That's I like that term, Dr. Hill. So, no, I absolutely respect that. And again, my focus is not Kanye. Again, it was just the timing of it, just the fact that this is happening. And like recently, another thing that's been trending in relations to the Kanye situation, because as you said, Christy, people have always kind of wondered, and people ask me, because I haven't really followed the situation, to be honest, but I've had people ask me this week, well, what do you think of Kanye? And the reality is, it's sad that my first thought was, I'm not necessarily surprised. And it's because of what you're talking about, that little awe for what's going on with his level of arrogance or whatever you want to call it. You're like, well, what's driving this? And so the sad thing is, now that this has happened, I think there's a lot of people that are, in a sense, not surprised. And go ahead, Kristen.
Well, it's not even only that we're not surprised, but I think a lot of times when we see those things, like with his behavior on live television or broadcast television, we don't necessarily attribute it to his mental health. Sometimes we assume that there's drug use involved, as like with Martin Lawrence or with Cat Williams or any of these celebrities who kind of gone astray from what appears to be mentally healthy. We automatically assume that it's drug use, instead of there's something going on in their mind that might need to be fixed.
Yeah, I can imagine, Dr. Hill, I'm pretty sure that stigma is associated with a lot of people that you deal with, that the assumption is that it's something else. Because let's be honest, when it comes to mental illness, specifically in the African American community, we, for the most part, don't like to deal with it. And that in a sense, we let, obviously when we talk about Kanye, the celebrity that's kind of out in front of us, but there was a verse by another artist by the name of J. Cole that's trending again in the social media, and he made a verse typically kind of directed at Kanye, and a lot of people were calling it a quote-unquote diss in the hip-hop community. I listened to the verse, and the brother says in the verse that in reality, this brother is asking for help. And so I didn't see the verse as necessarily a diss, and we can get in, I don't want to get into that, but the aspect that he made reference to, that in all reality, this brother is reaching out for help. And that's what we typically see. We typically see that people act out in ways that we don't understand, when it's, in a sense, their cry for help. Because, and you can answer this for me, Dr. Hill, but do you think that sometimes we see that act out because of the stigma that's associated within our community, as far as being able, for example, as a man, just simply saying, hey, this is my issue, I need help? I think people avoid doing it that way because of, if you say, I may have like say I'm bipolar, whatever one of these different, the depression or whatever the case may be, it seems weaker to just kind of say, I think I may have this issue. So do people, in a sense, act out versus just coming out and saying this is what's going on? Or is it more of a situation that they've just been driven to the point to act out and they don't know how to ask for help, if that makes sense?
I'll talk about it, kind of hit on a couple of points that both of you have talked about, and I'll start with the one you just asked. Is the first thing is the education. Because if I'm not educated about what mental health is myself, then I don't even know when there's something wrong with me. So then once I am educated, I will recognize something is going wrong with me. I am not healthy. If you can imagine in your biology, if you don't know what's wrong with a cold, if you have a cold, your nose is running, and you have no idea that something is wrong. You can't attribute it to a cold. You don't even know that it is a cold. Then you don't know how to treat it. So the first thing is let's get educated about what mental health is. So then the second thing is let's not medicate it. Let's treat it. Because Christy said a lot of times you will add drug use to it because you don't know what's going on. So you will go to your your drinking, your smoking, to try to get some relief.
Self-medication.
So if we're not educated, then we go to medicating it and not treating it. Then the third thing I think Christy hit on was that we don't know how to reach out for help. If I can recognize it, and not medicated, then where do I go to get help and treatment?
Not just that, but I think a lot of us feel that there's a stigma involved, and a lot of times, like he's talking about, when we act out, a lot of times our acting out and asking for help or seeking help is met with social punishments that we're often afraid to endure. So I think a lot of times we just avoid it altogether or pretend like everything's normal so that we don't suffer these social injustices as a result of being labeled.
I'll compare it to the evolution of physical health. You remember back in the day when if something was ailing, mom went to get a salve or a rag or something that tie around it. She didn't necessarily go to the doctor to get medicine because they thought it was treatable at home. So we're in the evolution of mental health where we believe we can treat it. And if you think about the evolution of our biology with all the foods that we're eating, all the chemicals that's being put in the food, we can no longer treat a cut or a bruise or a stomachache with homegrown remedies. And we can no longer treat mental health issues with homegrown issues. And we've just got to realize that. It's just an evolution of where we've gone in our society with all the publicity, and everybody thinks they can be famous overnight, and all these social injustices that are happening. We've got to make that evolution with our mental health to say that it's no longer a mom and pop, that we've got to evolve. We used to wouldn't have surgery,
kind of own up to the psychology of the selfie world.
Absolutely.
It actually leads to a level of narcissism
and distress
to the extent that now we're starting, I'm assuming, because this is your career field, we're starting to see new issues due to this thing. Technology is a beautiful thing, but I know I've written pieces about how it's easier to contact each other, but we're less in contact with each other as far as how we deal with each other.
More isolated.
So I can only imagine that, for example, not getting likes and things like this are starting to drive. Is that driving your industry? Because when you mention that, it's just kind of working in my brain, and I'm kind of working it out as we talk.
Right.
Like thinking about this, like what type of things are you seeing due to this new social media age when it comes to mental illness? What type of things are you seeing?
You typically would have seen, and maybe an adult person having distress because I've got to go to work, I've got bills to pay. Now I am seeing an influx of teenagers coming in struggling with mental health, social relationships that typically wasn't before. So now we are just on the cusp of dealing with mental health in adults, and there is a revolution going on with our children. So social media and all of that is absolutely playing into that. Whether I don't get a like, the whole sexting and all of that.
Is it adding to mental health, or is it just exposing it? Because I know, like, a lot of times with social media, we see where a lot of things that have been going on for a very long time seem like they're like more prevalent now, but that's just because they have more exposure. Everybody's got a camera and a Facebook account where they can post stuff. So is it maybe that we're just seeing more of it being, publicized as a result of social media, or is social media actually driving people to have more mental health issues due to the isolation and the depression and the internet bullying and all of that kind of stuff?
I think it's a driver. I think it absolutely is a driver, because there's an evolution that says you can use something, and then I think the social media has given us a chance to abuse it, right? So to your point, we've always used those kind of things, we've always said those kind of things, but the social media age gives us a chance to abuse it, and whenever you go from use to abuse, then you add mental health distress.
Wow.
Yeah, I would absolutely say that, obviously you know better than I do, but I can only imagine that it's a driver. Absolutely. I mean, just because of the things that we're talking about now, there's this look at me world to the extent that people are forming their entire identities without, almost in a way, at a younger age, to the extent that I can only imagine that's going to affect them for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely.
Because now let's move out of the social media age and go back to historically. Okay, we're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, we'll actually get into historically how these stigmas have led to what we see specifically in the African American community, and why, in fact, we don't deal with it, as you said. So when we come back from break, you're listening to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, live on Facebook for the first time. We'll be right back. We're at Mango's Caribbean Restaurant. All I ask is that you think.
Are you hungry for authentic Caribbean food like jerk chicken, oxtail, red snapper, shrimp, tofu, and rasta pasta? Well, find your way over to Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Peacock in downtown Atlanta.
Them belly full, but we hungry.
Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, open daily from 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. And on Friday and Saturday, we're open till 4 a.m. Come to Mango's and put some spice in your life.
Oh, we've got a good thing going.
Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Peacock in downtown Atlanta. For more info or directions, call 404-698-3992 or log on to mangoscaribbeanrestaurant.com. For instant coupons, text MANGOS to 313131.
Tell your mama hungry, papa hungry, brother hungry.
Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, authentic Caribbean cuisines.
Are
you exclusive? Got a big event? Need hair? Well, contact Exclusively Pure Hair for 100% authentic, unprocessed virgin hair for the exclusive lady. 972-51.
In the black community. Why is it so bad? I'm good. So this is the first time Facebook Live here at the Mango's Caribbean Restaurant. But before the break, we were actually just talking about a lot of things that are associated with mental illness. And Dr. Hill, you were kind of telling us that you're starting to see more of it with the teenagers. Mm-hmm. And we also kind of talked about, mentioned the Kanye situation and also mentioned that there are stigmas associated with it. I want to kind of dig deeper into that because I think in a sense, in my opinion, without lifting the veil on the stigmas that still seem to be associated with mental health, specifically in our community. So, like, for example, without even getting into the specific of the numbers, the thing that seems to be consistent and has always been consistent is the fact that we seem to, in our community specifically, to seem to go undiagnosed in comparison to other cultures quite often, which kind of is pretty much prevalent in a lot of issues, when you even get into physical health. Sometimes that's due to cost. But that's also the thing that factors in, too. The cost associated with mental health, to a certain extent, can play a role in it. But more so than the cost is this idea that there's a stigma that we don't have that problem. Like, you hear that people say that, for example, mental health is a white folks problem. Like, we say that sometimes. Go ahead, Dr.
Let's talk about that number for a moment, because in the United States of America, and I'll only use those statistics, 13.8% of the U.S. population is African American. Of the 13.8%, which is about 45 or 46 million people, 16% of them have a diagnosable mental health issue. That is more than the population of Houston. I think it's Houston. It's 3 cities combined. So it's not like we don't have a diagnosable issue. And we probably have more than that if we all were to get treated. Because, again, I always like to compare it to physical health. You think about the number of people in African-American culture who have medical diagnosable issues. It's not any less than the Caucasian, because we're more used to going to get that diagnosed. And it's even with what we can diagnose is about 16.7% of it, which is like 45 million. How many people have diagnosable mental health issues that have been diagnosed?
How much of it do you actually think is misdiagnosed, though?
A lot, quite a bit.
I think a lot of times, I mean, I've just being in the school system and working in the school system, I've noticed that there is an increase of children being diagnosed with various mental illnesses and behavioral disorders and all kinds of issues. And sometimes I look at these children, they're really quick to medicate them. Yep. And they're less quick to actually deal with whatever the underlying cause of the issue is. It's like, let's put a Band-Aid on the problem and send them to school so the teacher can deal with them. But what I'm wondering a lot of times is if the diagnosis isn't actually what they're calling it, and maybe something else, like maybe diet related or stuff going on in the home that's not being dealt with, and they're just calling it, ADD or ADHD or whatever other kind of depression. I know sometimes food specifically can lead to depression.
So if we talk about diagnosis and then we secondary talk about treatment, like I'll use ADHD. ADHD is probably one of the I'll say middle school diagnosis that is absolutely overdiagnosed. Sometimes it is misdiagnosed with a learning disability, an attention disability, and actually distress that's going on in the home. If I'm acting out at school consistently, the teacher doesn't really know. I just keep getting sent to either the principal's office or to the counselor's office.
Right.
So I will give a shout out for our public education system. I think they're doing the best that they can with what they have to deal with. And I won't say that they're doing anything wrong, but it's not the right thing to do for our kids. But I won't blame the school system necessarily for that, because they're doing the best they can with what they have, because we have, to your point, just a lot of it happening. And the quickest fix is to send them there and get them medicated, recommend to the parents, if you don't get them medicated, they can't come back to school.
Well, I know in a lot of communities, it's been recognized that children who go through divorce and things like that start acting out in school.
Mm-hmm.
So same way, when these kids are acting out, even as being a product of a single parent home, or with the loss of a parent, or a parent going to jail, whatever the case may be, that's usually not the thing that's initially addressed in diagnosing the child. So is that something we might want to look at as well?
Absolutely. You hit on a couple of points that I said. If these stressors are happening in the life of a child, divorce, death, that child actually needs mental health treatment. It's almost like I would consider it a cold at the moment, and you don't leave a cold untreated. It's not a severe mental health issue, but it's something that absolutely needs some level of treatment and some level of mental care, because under the age of 16, a child is not mentally equipped to deal with divorce or death. They're just not. And so if you don't give them some level of assistance, like your body can't fight off pneumonia, you can't fight that off mentally. So you repress it, and sometimes they'll show up again as signs of anxiety or depression or anger. All of that being repressed, if it's not treated, will show up in different ways.
Yeah, as I listen to you, it hurts me to even think about what y'all are talking about. And again, I'm relating it back to these stigmas that are associated in our community, because we already know, for example, when we are constantly talking about police brutality, the concept of how our young children are not treated as young children, even in certain situations, whether it be a Tamir Rice or examples like that. Right. Well, the exact same thing happens with the situation you just pointed out. We are quite often dealing with so much, if we're honest about what's going on in our entire community. A lot of times, if we're not experiencing these things, we tend to separate or surround ourselves with people and say, well, this is not a major problem in our community. But the reality is, we do have, unfortunately, a lot of children that are living in poverty, and in their circumstances in which the things you're talking about are become normalized for our young children. So it plays a role in why that young child may go into that office and not get ask those certain questions or treated the same, because even the school realizes this child is already dealing with some level of trauma, and we can't. I mean, if what I'm saying is making sense.
It's even worse than that, because as teachers, you're also encouraged to not have physical contact a lot of times with children, or not interact. And sometimes those kids don't get any affection at home, or their parents aren't even home enough to give them the attention that they need. I had one student who would come to school, and every day she would just act out. And one day I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "My dad died," And I was like, "Oh, come give me a hug." And she's like, "Get away from me, get away from me." And me and the other teacher encircled her and hugged her, and you could just feel her entire body just a weight, just kind of release. And from that time, she's always next to me, always, because I would see her and see sometimes, her acting out wasn't an act of aggression, but just an act of, somebody give me some attention, please see me. And I would often, when I would see kids who were acting out, say, "Oh, you need a hug today?" And they would just look at me baffled, come hug me, and then they would behave for the rest of the day.
So let's talk about, I would say this is the first treatment for mental health. This is the easiest, most accessible treatment for mental health, is conversation and communication. I remember doing a training curriculum for a elementary school probably 10 years ago. And so as a result of doing that training, I did some research on how do we interact with our children as parents. One of the stats that I ran across is that we only spend about 10 to 12 minutes per day communicating with our kids. And I'm thinking, at the time I had small kids, and I was like, oh no, not me. I spend more than 10 to 12 minutes a day talking to my kids. So I looked at it, I measured it, in my home. I said, okay, kids, get up. It's time to go to school. They get up, they go to school. All right, love you. Y'all have a good day. I go 8 hours, I don't talk to my kids. I come back home. You guys have homework? Okay, let's get your homework done. Time for dinner. And so I added it all up. And me, who at the time I thought I was one of the best parents, I measured it, and I was probably spending on average 12 to 15 minutes per day talking to my kids. And this, I said, this was years ago. So I decided to effectively break that cycle. And so it was just by education and awareness that I didn't realize that I wasn't talking to my kids every day. And then you think about all the social activities and the football and the basketball and the soccer practice. We are not talking to our kids. So one of the first and easiest treatment is we've got to start engaging, putting down these devices at the dinner table, getting these kids back at the dinner table, talking about what's going on at school. Did Johnny talk to you? And one of the most heartbreaking things that one of my adult kids, she's adult now, that told me, she says, Mom, do you remember the day that I came home in 4th grade and I did something and I went to my room and I didn't come out? I'm like, no, I don't remember that. She remembered it vividly because it was something traumatic that had happened to her on the school bus that day. And I, because of working and busy, and so I missed it. So the other thing is, the second level of treatment is we as parents have got to slow down enough with our world of work and with our world of social media to actually begin to be attentive to our kids so we can pay attention to the things that they're not ready to talk about, but they're showing all kinds of signs and symptoms.
Right.
But we're just, and I was one of the, what I thought was good parents, and I missed it. So I know we're missing it.
Wow. 10 to 12 minutes.
10 to 12 minutes on average.
And for anybody out there watching or listening, something to think about. I hope to have children one day, but obviously anybody that knows me, I do a mentor program after school with the YMCA, which I'm fortunate enough to do that. I love children. And so it's amazing to think that could be an issue. And something particular to that particular job is I'm in a pretty decent area for is where I'm doing my after school program. Well, that's where they put me at this purposes. And I talk to my coworkers all the time about that. I think it's a beautiful situation in these situations where most of these kids seem to have both their parents. It's not just both parents alone makes it work. We have single parents as well. Right. But I get to see very healthy relationships, even in that small interaction from when they're picking the kid up or whatever. I see some very healthy relationships. And it makes me, I'm at 42, look, and I've talked about this on YouTube before, the idea of, wow, this is what it was supposed to be like. Yeah. I was just talking about when I see those healthy relationships and knowing that we don't have enough of that in our community. This is not just to stigmatize our community. This is to address and try to improve it. So I say all that to say, it's a possibility, as much as I say those are healthy, that those parents may even be doing, because some of those kids are just as busy. They tell us, I've got to go to soccer, I got to go to this band practice and this horseback riding, the things that we weren't able to do in my community. They have all these things that these kids are doing. I like it. I love it. I love to see my kids happy and have these enjoyable these relationships. But as I hear you say that, I'm going, okay, what if these parents are only doing the average?
Oh, they're average.
So if they're doing the average and I consider this healthy, do you see where I'm going when I go to our community where I've mentored in schools and specifically in our community and saw a big difference?
Absolutely.
And I'm like, well, it looks different if they're doing the average, because I know these kids when I was mentoring in these other schools wasn't getting any of that.
Doesn't necessarily mean communication. So in that scenario, you may have the parents spending a lot more time with the child, being at their activities, but I'm not talking to them. And one of the things that a child needs from 0 to 12 is actually talkative communication with their parents. That's when you're instilling what you want them to behave like at 14, 15, 16, 17, and at 18, they're gone. They're gone. I mean, they're off in college, they're gone.
I actually think I spend more time than that talking to my kids. But that was intentional. When my kids were young, I drove a school bus, and one of the things, I drove North County and South County, which was a high-class area versus a lower-class area. One of the things that I noticed was that the parents that were there, that were like walking their kids to the bus, that were talking to their kids, spending time with them, their children's behavior was significantly different than the children whose parents were not there with them, in the morning or at the bus stop or even after school when they got home. The difference in behavior was extreme. And so watching this on a daily basis, I was like, I'm going to have to do whatever I can to be there with my children whenever they get out of school. And I've gotten a lot of judgment because people are like, oh, you don't want to work, you don't want to do this or that, you know, you're lazy. And I'm like, no, I've made a diligent effort to do whatever it takes to stay home and spend time with my children when they come home, because I see what the alternative looks like. But I do agree with what you're saying, that the vast majority of people don't, you're saying don't communicate with them, but the vast majority of people in our community don't even spend that much time.
So I'll do it this way. This is the way, the areas and categories I measure. Whether the parent is present, whether the parent is, not present. The parents are just not there. Not present, present. There are times when most of us grew up, if our parents were present, that was as good. They didn't get involved. So present, not present, present, involved, which means what you said, I'm at the bus stop, I'm doing whatever. And there's even a higher level of being an engaged parent.
Right.
I'm engaged. My youngest child, I was probably the most engaged with. Every friend she has, I know their names. Mm-hmm. I know who they are. I know their personalities. I can tell her about Susan as much as she can tell me about Susan.
Right. Wow.
And she's telling me about David. And I'm like, what? David did that. Well, last week David didn't do da-da-da. So that's an engaged parent.
Right.
So
that's
there's different than involved. I've always been an involved parent. I've always been there at the games, taking to this and walking to the bus stop. I've always done that. But what I recognize as a mental health professional, it's not enough to be involved. I've got to be engaged.
Right.
So you go from absent to engage, and there's a big, span there, and we just have to assess ourselves as parents as to kind of where we are.
And I just want to reiterate that in your own assessment, while you were involved, your communication again, when you checked yourself, was the average of 10 to 12 minutes. I just want to kind of reiterate that, because that number hits home for me to think about, because of where I want to go with this. Because
I love my mom, but I look back and I think back at how many conversations my mom and I had, and we didn't have any. She was absolutely involved at every play, at everything she could do. She was as best, but I just think, especially in the community, in the society in which we live today, we've got to move it forward and become engaged.
So what you just said is a perfect segue to moving this conversation. So as you said that, y'all didn't talk, you and your mom, you loved her to death. So in our community, what was happening in my little small town growing up, playing football and playing sports, we actually thought it was weak as the black kids. We thought it was weak that our white friends had to have their parents there at the game. Like if we lost, their parents was there pampering them, and we were like, that's weak. Wow. And I'm talking about to the extent, this is how we chase manhood as kids, to the extent that if we was up against a tough opponent, we felt like we could rely on each other, and we were tougher in this fight or in this game. I'm just telling you how we thought.
That's how gangs evolved, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just kind of sharing out, watching, because what we're talking about, I want to relate it to our own experience, because you said something a few minutes ago. You said at 18 they're gone. So as we're focused, because Kristen, you brought us on this focus of children, which I'm happy about, as we're talking about how we're interacting and wanting to improve the possible mental health of our children, which you talked about the difference in how children act, and I see that at my school too.
Right.
I can see the children that I'm mentoring who have issues at home. Of course, the rules are we can't necessarily get into all of that, but sometimes you have to learn to ask the right questions.
Right.
But we definitely know a healthier situation, probably more involved situations, not the engaged thing, which is another level. Yep. I love hearing that. But anyway, I saw that to say at 18 they're gone. So if your 18 years was the not present, involved or less, how are we acting, and how are we dealing with that as adults?
Absolutely.
Like, that's the question to kind of talk about, and that's what I'm assuming there are people out there that can relate who've never thought to come see a professional.
All right.
Because that's the stigma that's still going with our society.
No.
We
Or
don't do that.
worse.
We don't need to do that. So my question is, if you had that non-present situation, what are we seeing play out when you're getting people as adults who finally say, you know what, I need to see Dr. Hill? What are you seeing?
There are 12 layers of an onion that have to be peeled back. I remember probably one of the most emotional scenarios for me played out when there was a man in my office. He was probably 60 plus years old. And as we began to peel back the onion of what was going on in his current life and relationships, he peeled back the onion all the way to 8 to 9 year old experience where his father was not present. and engage with him at times when he really needed him to be. And this is a 60-year-old man playing out, and as we begin to unpeel it back, so that was probably what we've got to recognize. If we don't, we just keep putting layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers on top of this need for mental health, and one day they will be exposed and will hurt probably our kids, our spouses, family members, and siblings in the wake of that. So I think it's a cry for all of us as a community that we've got to start dealing with this and addressing this. And I'll give a shout out for mental health. What I tell people that I engage with about mental health is if you have a medical doctor, get you a psychologist. It's almost as necessary as you don't go to your doctor every day, but when you feel like you're not feeling too good and you can't handle it, you pick up the phone and you say, I need an appointment. So we've got to make this transition to where we feel like we should be as comfortable having a psychologist in our Rolodex or in our contacts as we do our medical doctor. Most of us have a medical doctor or professional. And the good thing about it is mental health is covered under your benefits. You don't have to pay for that.
I don't think a lot of people know that, so I think you should probably, reiterate that. I was just going to say a lot of people probably don't know or that they can go to a psychologist and use their same insurance and
absolutely
get that mental health checked out.
And that was my first thought. My first thought was our concern is always going to be finances, which is, there's times when we know we need a physical situation and don't get it, even deal with it because we're worried about the ultimate cost of it or whatever. Chris, I think you had something before. I want to make sure let you get that in.
I was going to say that a lot of times, we think that we can't afford, the mental health, and we think it doesn't show. We think nobody can see it, and so it's not something that we need to take care of. And that, I think, a lot of times is the biggest thing. Is even if our insurance might cover it, we might think we can't afford the deductible. And when you're talking about people who live in communities where they don't, have very much, the last thing they think to spend money on, which is probably the thing they most need to spend money on, is having that mental health check.
So I was telling you earlier that my practice has more than just the counseling practice. I do forums, I do webinars, I do things that are free. I do things that are group, so the cost is more. You may pay X number of dollars to come for a one-on-one session because you want the privacy. But if you're willing to come to a group session, whether it's your marriage, whether it's your children, or parenting session, you pay a lot less from that. Most of the deductibles are somewhere between $25 and $35. And I am an African American. I'm a part of this community. And what I say we don't have money for is what we choose to not have money for. I see people paying $900 for a weave, but yet they don't have $35 to pay for a session for mental health, checkup for themselves or their children.
$200 for a pair of shoes.
$200 for a pair of shoes. So I think we've got to be more conscious about where we're spending our money.
That, so,
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic. So we've got to be conscious about where we put our money and what we're getting the return on that investment. I would say even if you do a checkup, I do a lot of premarital relationship counseling for mental relationship health. And so if we make a little bit of a segue from mental health to relational health, then you think about if I'm not healthy, then my relationship isn't going to be healthy.
That's true.
So that's huge, that the relationship between me is not going to be healthy.
Well, perfect. Let's head on that segue after the break. You're listening to or watching, I should say, first time on Facebook Live here at Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. We'll be right back. Well, all I ask is that you think.
Very good.
Something that wasn't quite you? Girl, stop. Don't ever do that again. Instead, go to braidedwigs.com and get wigs for us by us. Not only do they have full lace braided wigs, but dreadlock wigs. Girl, they even got kinky twist wigs. These wigs look so natural, people won't believe it's a wig, even after you tell them. I mean, if you tell them. Young, older, in between. braidedwigs.com. High quality, long lasting, original hand braided wigs shipped directly to your doorstep. Tell the Mental Dialogue sent you and receive a discount on your first wig. braidedwigs.com. This is not your average wig company.
Hungry for authentic Caribbean food like jerk chicken, oxtail, red snapper, shrimp, tofu, and rasta pasta? Well, find your way over to Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Pico in downtown Atlanta. Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, open daily from 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. And on Friday and Saturday, we're open till 4 a.m. Come to Mango's and put some spice in your life. Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Pico in downtown Atlanta. For more info or directions, call 404-698-3992 or log on to mangoscaribbeanrestaurant.com. For instant coupons, text MANGOS to 313131.
Mama hungry, Papa hungry, brother hungry.
Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, authentic Caribbean cuisine.
You exclusive? Got a big event? Need hair? But contact Exclusively Pure Hair for 100% authentic unprocessed virgin hair for the exclusive lady. 972-540-4403 or check out the website at www.exclusivelypurehair.com for the exclusive one.
The opportunity and wonder if I ever had a chance with you. Dance and dance with you. Posing a professional picture, take a stand with you.
Welcome back to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. I'm your host, Montoya Smith, a.k.a. Black Socrates, along with co-host Christy Gaynell. And we are fortunate enough to have in expert on mental health, Dr. Monica Hill, as we're discussing mental illness in the black community. What's so bad about it? And so we've definitely been digging into this and pulling back some of the layers. And again, as we've had a discussion, we've kind of talked about, you know, basically how to deal and do better with our children. And you just talked about the idea of just simply communicating. Something that came to my mind is, you know, that's something that helps even for people with addiction. Like, the reality is we don't realize how little we actually engage, and we do understand it from the standpoint that we all say we know we're doing it less because we're on these phones, but not realizing we had a problem before the phones existed as far as the amount of engagement based on what you just explained. You know what I mean? The fact that the average parent, if you're just now tuning in, the average parent, if you're out there, you spend 10 to 12 minutes talking to your children daily. Dr. Hill measured herself and found that to be true. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that one thing. But before the break, we were kind of starting to segue into what I like to tag is hashtag Black Love. That's what I call it, from the standpoint of the reality is when it comes to our relationships in our community, mental health is a big issue.
Right.
Even though we don't necessarily recognize it, and we don't recognize it partly for even what I was talking about for the break as a young child, saying, well, we thought these kids were soft because they couldn't handle situations, because we have this concept of being tough, and it's partly because in our community we have a lot to deal with. Just anyway.
Right.
And then you want to put other things on top of life in general, you know, specifically certain communities. Well, we try to consummate relationships, never having dealt with our mental illness. And so it was cool to hear you say you do a lot of counseling in relation to that. Because I'm used to, like, for example, my mother, she just got married. So, of course, she went and got in front of the preacher for that counseling session.
Right.
But this is my first time ever even hearing in my life that you play this role for two people who are about to enter a marriage, which as soon as I hear it, it makes so much sense.
So let me talk about the difference in counseling. And I do counseling. My counseling, whenever you go to a therapist, what you want to know is what is their theoretical orientation, which means how are they going to provide mental health and counsel to you. There's two different, one is through a faith base. A lot of times when people go to counseling, they will go to their church, and that is one avenue of counseling. But the other one is someone who can professionally and psychologically help you evaluate. And I'll give you an example. Like, if you go to your church, they're probably not going to talk to you about perspectives, right? So one of the biggest things that happen between a couple is they'll argue. They'll be arguing, right? So the reason arguments come about is that I'm trying to share my perspective, you're trying to share your perspective, and perspective has two ingredients. It's your knowledge and your experience. My perspective is going to be based on the knowledge that I have and the experience that I have, which could be totally different than the knowledge that you have and the experience that you have. So if you go to a theological counselor, you may say, pray about it and, pray together, which is great. But it cannot overlook the fact that we're talking perspectives here. And if I just understand that my knowledge and experience is not the same as yours, and I should be willing to listen to what you know and what you've experienced, and then you listen to what I know and what I've experienced, and then we'll come to a decision together. But people try to just match these things together because we're in relationship and we've got to come to agreement, and it's not giving respect to each other's knowledge and experience.
Right. I was married. I did not have any counseling before I got married, and as we were approaching getting divorced, I suggested that we have counseling before we get divorced. Several times I was like, let's go to counseling, let's go see somebody, and my husband didn't want to. He did not want to get anybody else involved. He didn't think anybody else's opinions mattered. He thought whoever we talked to was probably just going to side with me and make him feel like, the bad guy. And so he's like, no, I don't want to, or sometimes, if he thought that it would help, bring me in a little closer, he would say yes, but then take no further action towards actually doing it. Whether I, made an appointment, called somebody, getting him there was not going to happen. And I've seen that to be the case in a lot of relationships with, our people. Is a lot of times the woman's like, yeah, let's go to counseling, and the guy's like, no, I don't want to. And it's kind of that same thing where men don't want to go to the doctor. I don't know what it is with men and the stigma of being treated for any illness, really, whether it's physical or mental. They just feel like they can handle it.
To the African American men, and I will give them a shout out as far as my practice is concerned. I see them evolving. My husband helped me take the calls and set the appointments, and what he sees is there's so many more men that are calling now.
That's
so I will
awesome.
give them a shout out that they're evolving and they're trying to make their home stable and their relationship stable. And sometimes it is a result of maybe I've messed up, but now I know I'm the one that has to fix it, and they're stepping forward and making that call. I've been blessed enough to do quite a bit of work with NFL, and so I'll give a shout out for that group of men in that I did a marriage conference about, I think it was back in October. What's this? This is December? It was in April. And there were 100 couples at the conference. I had 149 written comments back, and people usually don't write comments. They just say liked it, didn't like it. I had 149 written sentences back. I could tell by reading those that most of those were written by men. Makes sense. So I think we are having an evolution in the African American population that men are now seeing, and I do believe it's because I'm an African American. I think that's probably one of the things they like, getting counsel from someone who knows them, their symptoms, their situation. I'm an African American woman. I know half of our problems at least, and I know how we project some of that on our African American men. So I get it. I get why they don't go, because they don't know that there's many of us out there that's willing to help. But they're coming. They're coming.
To be fair, my situation was over a decade ago, so
right.
that's awesome. That's good to hear.
And if we could even give a shout out or encouragement, because as we talked about in the beginning of the show, this is a growing field from the standpoint of the stigmas being lifted.
Right.
Just even, it's not just in our community. Let's not just make it seem like it's just in our community, but some of what you're talking about, Christy, with your husband, could simply just be, like you said, we don't even do physical. Like, I come from that ilk. I'm a country boy. I've been fortunate that when I get checkups every 2 years, 3, 4, sometimes 3. Either way, I'm fortunate that those checkups are, I try to take care of myself. But again, we will rely on our own home stuff, right? That's what we do.
Yeah, even me. I don't go to the doctor.
Right, right. So some of what we need to talk about is any ideas that you have to lower that stigma, like, because here it is, we know that it exists, we know that we don't do this, we know that we don't do that, or like you said, I've seen that with my friends, a lot of you only want to go to counseling during crisis, but it probably could have helped well in advance. So like you said, finding out about the idea that you could go to a therapist, which if I'm fortunate enough to get married, I'm gonna do that.
Absolutely.
I've never heard that in my life. I've never even heard of it.
Based on what you're saying there, if I ever get married, at what point in a relationship during the dating process is that something that you might want to consider doing? Because a lot of times you might be with somebody that you really care about, and it doesn't even get to, I want to marry this person, just because you can't work through the stigma or the mental health problems that you don't even know exist and haven't bothered to find out. So if you're dating somebody, is that something that, you might consider doing at a certain point in the relationship?
So if I'm dating someone, you're not going to go to counseling with everybody. You start dating. So if I evolve the relationship and I say, okay, I'm starting to date Johnny, right? And I'm dating Johnny. And
Raheem, you date Raheem.
Raheem, I'm dating. I am dating Raheem, and here's the first trigger, is I'm dating Raheem. Raheem is dating me, and both of us decide we want to take this further. Because sometimes Raheem says, I want to take it further, and Shanique was saying, nah, I'm not ready.
Oh, wow.
Or Shanique was saying, then Raheem, I got you. So then if Raheem and Sandra are dating each other, and they said, we want to take this further, right? So then we say, is there anything standing in the way of us evolving this relationship to the next level? Your mama, our finances, your baby mama, your baby daddy. So if we decided we've got a relationship that we want to take further, then you look at the things that are standing in the way of taking it to the next level. If you can get through those things at the next level, fine. You don't necessarily need counseling. Then I'm just going to walk this out in a sunny day situation. We don't need any. We can work through all of our baby mama, our finances. We can get through all of that. The third level, I think a lot of people really do need help with, is what is marriage? What is this? So I believe a level of understanding, because the number one thing we do in premarital counseling is try to erase all the myths. It is not going to be that sunny day after it happens. It has a purpose. It has a milestones and phases in this relationship. And when you get in phase after the honeymoon, is the hardest.
Yeah.
And people get disenchanted in that second phase. So if we decide we want to have a relationship, we decide these are the blockers, we can get through the blockers, then I think if you get through phase two, which most people can't, they have to get some help in getting through those blockers. Then if you even get through those, you definitely probably need some help and education and training and counseling around this thing that I'm about to get into. What is it? And what I say, and I fought the states for this, is that you can even learn to drive without a license.
Right.
Take a test, you figure out all the rules, the regulations, and I think that same thing needs to go when issuing a marriage license.
Yeah.
Wow. What are all the rules and regulations? You absolutely need to know empathy. Because if you don't know empathy, if I do premarital counseling, one of the things you get taught and understand and I test you on is, do you have empathy? Can I hear what you're saying? My mental maps are so strong as a male, my mental maps are so strong as a female, I can't even understand what you're saying. One of the examples I love to use with my husband and I is that testosterone. What is this?
Right.
And my mental map was so strong with estrogen, and you got to be in love, and you got to feel good, and everything's got to be right, and sunny days, that testosterone just to need to be with me, I don't understand that. So if I didn't have empathy and know that I don't understand it, but it's a part of his world, then I'm not feeling you. I don't care what you need. But empathy absolutely has to.
Say that again, Dr. Hill. Say that again, please. Let's repeat. Let's go back over this section.
He's like, let's go back to testosterone. That's where I want to go.
Yeah, did y'all hear the doctor say that?
And estrogen. He missed that part.
He missed the estrogen. All he heard was testosterone.
And the love, I got to have both.
He didn't realize that.
I understand. We gotta get y'all there. That's something we can talk about. We gotta get you there.
You have to have empathy too.
Absolutely.
Of course. I mean, I got to do more work to get you there.
Yep.
That's how they play out both
That means
ways.
you have to understand where the there is to get us to.
Of course.
Yeah, I'll say it again.
He didn't hear me. He didn't hear me.
I can't expect you, now that you understand me, just to.
But see, I say that because a lot of men will say, I got to get you there, and they think it's like a step-by-step format. Let me push this button, let me twiddle this knob, let me do, and that's not get you there. That's get you there.
No, I'm saying get you there from your understanding.
But that's the point. To get us there from our understanding, you have to have our understanding. That's what empathy is.
That's what I meant.
I'm just clarifying for the audience.
I'm bad doing this with the mic too. I talk to people who do communication. I do communication seminars, and the thing that we tell people is two things. There's honest communication, which is what a lot of people don't want to have.
Right.
And I say, but the other part of it is that you have to start listening in order. No, we have to stop listening to reply and start listening to understand.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
So let's keep, because here's something I always said. I want to hear your thoughts on this, Dr. Hill. And this is, again, the Mental Dialogue community. We talk about all kind of subjects, right? And so I'm very, very, very concerned about our relationships at the basic level. I'm talking about just between us as black men and black women. I'm talking about even in friendship.
Right.
Just even in friendship, because for all the ills that we say, the foundation is we are struggling in how to have even a friendship quite often, but definitely in our basic form of relationships. And so what I quite often say, just from my reading and things that a lot of reading, I always kind of say that unfortunately what's happening in our community when we are getting trying to take the step to get married or be together, whatever you call marriage, that unfortunately we have a lot of, in a sense, unwhole people trying to consummate a relationship. And so in my personal opinion, not obviously from an expert opinion or a doctor's standpoint, so I always say that unfortunately, well, two people that are getting married, ultimately, if you're deciding to stay together for life, whatever the case may be, you really should try to enter that situation whole. But I think it's harder for us, based on all the things we're talking about, to enter the situations whole. So I think it plays a role in a lot of what we're seeing out there. And so ultimately, being whole, I think, requires a lot of what you do, which makes this conversation today so very important.
So if we think about wholeness, right? I thought about me individually. Am I whole as an individual? And when I got married to my husband, I thought both of us was fairly whole as individual, but we had lots of gaps relational. Our relationship wholeness was not there. My husband made me aware. He said, probably a couple of years into our marriage, he says, "Babe, you can be selfish." And I'm like, me? As an individual, whole person, selfish me? But what I was coming into aware of is that I don't know how to take what I want and make it available to what we need or want. So I was selfish relationally. I wasn't selfish as an individual person, right? I was very giving and very loving. So that was my basis and my framework. I said, I'm not selfish. I'm very giving. I'm very loving. I'm very kind as an individual. But relationally, not so much. And he was the first person in my life that had made me aware that I'm not relationally giving. Individually, I give, and I give charity. I love people. I do all kinds of kind stuff. So when you say wholeness, is that there's an individual wholeness assessment, like somebody could be just flat out selfish, don't give to nobody, don't love nobody, selfish, mean, whatever. That's individual lacking. But then sometimes those of us who can be relationally unhealthy or whole. And I will say that it's what I didn't have modeled for me as a child. Is when my husband came into my life and wanting to, I'm not even gonna say control me, but to be there for me. Like he said, baby, the worst problem you had was you always want to do things for yourself. Relationally, my mom was a single mom. She did everything for herself. There was no man that I saw sharing that responsibility. Absolutely, I'm modeling my mom. So relationally, I wasn't whole.
Right.
Yeah, I've said to somebody I've dated, you don't even know how to allow me to help you.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
You know, and
But it's
go ahead,
interesting
Christy.
that you mentioned too that relational selfishness, because that's one of the things that I experienced. And as you're saying that, I always thought my husband was the most selfish person I ever met. But my husband was also the best friend anybody could ever have, because anytime anybody needed anything, he was there. So as a friend, I was like, he's a great friend. I'm going to marry this person. Then we get married, and that friendship that he used to give me now extends to everybody else, and I'm put on the back burner because as the wife in his mind, I'm going to always be there. So he would jump up and run off to help any of his other friends, and as a wife, I experienced that as he's a selfish person. He's always putting his needs and everybody else's needs before mine. And I didn't even have the vocabulary and the context to distinguish that selfishness from a relational perspective and an inherent aspect of his being.
This is how significant this is. Every 5 or 7, 10 years or so, the mental health industry will come out with a different diagnostic manual. So when I graduated, the last one was the DSM-4. And in the DSM-4, all of the diagnoses were individual diagnoses, and the DSM-5 came out later. And for the very first time in mental health history, they have a relational diagnosis code, that it just could be the chemistry between us that is not right. There's nothing wrong with us as individual, but we don't know how to manage a relationship. That's why I think relationship counseling is ultimately significant, is to teach me now as a strong individual how to be relational.
Wow.
And
Wow, that's impressive.
That takes you to your knees.
Yeah, and I think I've witnessed that. And it's probably my own doing what I don't know about myself either. That plays a role, but I see what you're talking about quite often.
I think one of the other things that I experienced and I've witnessed a lot is depending on how you're raised, whether it's a single mother versus a single father versus a two-parent household, your opinions and ideas on what marriage is and what a relationship is vary greatly.
No, absolutely.
So a lot of times you might have a couple, a person who is the product of a married couple in a relationship with a person who's a product of a single parent, and their ideas on how to be in a relationship are so different that they don't even have the dialogue or the vocabulary or the know-how to communicate, you know, what they're experiencing, what they're feeling. They're coming from such different perspectives. And I think, to me, that is one of the leading causes of divorce and demise in marriage. So I always tell people you need to be evenly yoked, meaning find somebody who kind of had the same experience as you did growing up. If you grew up in a single mom family, you might want to look for, you know, that, so that you can at least communicate in the same context. But with regard to people who don't have that, who do differ in that aspect, how do you help them transverse that divide?
I tell people differences is never the challenge in a marriage. You can be as different as night and day. You can manage finances differently. You can have kids. He could not have kids. You could come from a married home. Differences is not necessarily what I see as the problem. It's our ability to manage differences, right? I become so grounded in the way that I was that I don't know anything different. And I become so grounded in the way that you should do it this way and I can't manage anything different. My husband and I are as different as night and day. The main difference is he's a male, I'm a female, right? That's one difference. So he grew up in inner city Houston, and I grew up as a country girl. So there are a mound of differences that we have, and we've been married 21 years, and I'll say 21 of those have been great. And this is not really just me saying that. I really think we've had a great marriage the full time. And it's not because we haven't had challenges, it's that we learned how to relationally, empathetically, work through those differences that we've had. Not only with the two of us, but we have a blended family. There's 3 children that grew up in that household, and all of that has to be mixed and mingled together, because I couldn't be mean to this child that's not biologically mine or the baby's mama. Any of that, all of that has to be relationally and evolved and understood. And managing differences, there was a huge difference in the way that my middle child's mom and I saw parenting. Huge. But that wasn't the problem. It was, can we sit down and manage through these differences? Am I relationally healthy enough, or do I want to get relationally healthy enough to learn how to manage through this difference of this baby's mama?
Yeah, I like that term. Do I want to get relationally healthy enough to get through this difference? Now, what I think you just told me was I just need to go marry me a psychologist. I think that's all you just told me just now. So any psychologist on the line, I'm single looking. No, I'm joking.
Yes, he needs you.
See, Chris even knows now. But again, as I work through this, matter of fact, let's open it up for anybody out there that may want to get in and ask Dr. Hill some questions. The number to get in is 678-619-1623. Again, that number is 678-619-1623, and we'll look forward to taking any calls. This is our first time on Facebook Live, so I'm working through it as we speak. But again, as I listen to this, I'm still concerned about our community as a whole, and I'm loving hearing these nuances of just like this idea of a relationship perspective. Like, again, never thought about that, and like you said, it just got put in a DSM-4. That's a beautiful thing, because it's definitely needed. We see it. I'm seeing it.
Tell us what that means. DSM-4 or DSM-5. What those are?
It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And there are iterations of it. Like this is when I graduated, it was the 4th iteration of it, and they've recently come out with the 5th iteration of it. And what it is a classification of every mental health diagnostic you could come up with. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. In it is the diagnosis itself. What are the symptoms that need to be present for you to be able to diagnose someone with this, and part of what we do to treat that, and the prevalence of it in African Americans, whether you see the prevalence in children or adults. It's kind of statistical information around that diagnosis, and it's a little bit of treatment around that.
And that's the perfect word, prevalence. That's what I want to kind of get into again, and we relate it back to our community. I think I was telling you before the show, about a year ago, we were fortunate enough to have on Dr. Consuelo Ward, and we did a show on post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a term coined by Dr. Joy DeGrasse. And so we were talking about that, and she was just talking about that there are 6 traumas that are related, in particular, according to Dr. DeGrasse, that are in particular and we're now understanding scientifically that traumas can be passed.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, so many years ago, they didn't have that down pat. They didn't know whether actual trauma itself could be passed, like physical things could be.
Right.
So now we're starting to understand that traumas can be passed down. So when we talk about prevalence, I would like, just in your experience, knowing that you do counseling and things of that nature, as you said, this DSM-4 even points out the statistics to what are we seeing. So what type of things are prevalent in our community? And we've already talked about we're still fighting the stigma even to deal with this stuff, but what type of things are prevalent in our community from your expertise? If you could just kind of address some general things, and maybe we can get into how it relates to this post-traumatic slave syndrome, because I think that plays a big role in why we're tough, why we put on this pose to get through life. We understand that's a part of our community, and so we just do it without any expertise, if that makes sense. So if you can just kind of, I'm kind of going broad here,
that's good.
but just kind of want to get into what's happening in our community, generally speaking, that needs to change when it comes to mental health.
So what I'm seeing a lot of is this. I see a lot of anger, and anger is a normal emotion. We all have it. It's what our triggers are that gets us angry. To what level do we become angry, and how do we behave once we are angry? So that's why you have anger management. You don't have anger quit as a mental health treatment. You don't have quit being angry. You have anger management. Once you get angry, how do you manage it? So I see a lot of anger. I see a lot of pornography that have really just, that along with infidelity, a lot of that is very prevalent in our community. I'm not saying it's only in the African American community, but I see it quite a bit. The inability to communicate. Once something has happened that has hurt me, then I can no longer talk to you. So I shut down the level of communication that we had, and we may not have been great anyway, but once we are upset or hurt, I don't even know how to talk to you anymore or receive what you're saying anymore because I can't forgive you. So anger, infidelity, pornography, inability to communicate, financial situations is that, because 75% of us, not only African Americans, but are dealing with secondary relationships with children, outside. Only 25% of the people in America today have traditional mom and dad, no extras. And so we are the majority. My husband and I are a blended family, so we are the majority when it comes to dealing with the way the family is, set up. It's not the traditional mom and dad, because that's only 25%. So blended families, financial situations, and those kind of impacts. And then the other thing is I'm seeing a rise with children. The other thing is children. And then the other thing is, how do I forge together to get myself healthy enough to get a relationship? Is that I don't think we know how to evolve.
Yeah, and as I listen to you, I want to kind of hone in on one thing you just said. And I want to kind of give a perspective, as you said, like you said, certain things you just mentioned, you're not trying to act like it's, in a sense, just us per se. But to hear you as a mental health professional say you're seeing infidelity, because how is that dealt with? How do we talk about that? We have shows about this all the time, and it's always, I believe this should happen, or like I just see somebody on Facebook recently ask, would you stay with someone who cheated on you while you were boyfriend and girlfriend versus when you're married? Like, that was like a little survey I saw, just a random survey that somebody did or whatever, and kind of cool to watch it. But I'm realizing we're dealing with this without even considering what type of mental traumas that are a part of our community. Let's be honest.
Absolutely.
To the extent that it's leading to, as you just said, more of it.
Okay.
Because you're basically, when I asked you that question, you're almost saying with mental health, that we wouldn't see it as much. It wouldn't be as prevalent as we kind of see it today. And we kind of say, oh, that's just society. Well, when we're saying it's just society, we're not realizing it's because we're not dealing with some levels of mental health that could actually alleviate. So if you could, give me some specifics to maybe something that you deal with, that once you've kind of maybe helped somebody work through their issues, that maybe they've improved and not just being out there with their infidelity within a situation where they've tried to be in a relationship, but clearly you're seeing it. So if you could just kind of maybe even talk about maybe some specifics to how you help somebody with that from a mental health standpoint, if that makes sense. So
I'll start with if my relationship is not healthy, right, it's not so much as mental health so much as just relational health. Again, it's not an individual diagnosis, it's a relational diagnosis. Okay. So if my relationship is not healthy, I can't talk to my husband, he gets on my last nerve, whatever. So I'm going to go talk to Sam at work. And so then Sam at work, I'm going to create a relationship with Sam at work because I can't talk to my husband. Then Sam and I are getting along okay. So then I'm going to be unfaithful to my husband because Sam is giving me what I need.
Right.
So the relational unhealthiness is absolutely causing people to go outside of that relationship to cause other things. And to be honestly, infidelity is on the rise for women. It's not just the men. A lot of women are going outside the marriage as well, or the relationship as well, to be. And again, this crazy thing is, most infidelity does not start off as infidelity. It starts off as I just need someone to talk to or listen to me or understand, or maybe I need financial support. And then this secondary leads into an intimate relationship. It's not always doesn't start like that.
So
I have a question. I had some issues previously with infidelity, and one of the things I couldn't wrap my mind around was the person's inability to admit, once they had committed this act, they refused to admit it. They couldn't admit it. And then I had another friend that was going through something similar, but they were the party that was being unfaithful. And I spoke to them about, I said, in my experience, this person was unable to even admit that they've done this thing. That was the issue that I had. And this person says to me, well, they probably haven't admitted it to themselves.
Absolutely.
They don't want to see themselves as that kind of person. They don't see themselves as that kind of person. In their mind, they are, a committed, faithful, loving mate. And because they refuse to see in themselves that I am now this quote-unquote cheater or unfaithful person, they haven't reconciled that in their mind, so then they can't verbalize it to the person they're with. Is that not also a form of mental unhealth, though?
Absolutely. And I'll use an example of my own personally. I remember, I don't curse typically, and I don't curse often. I've been married to my husband 21 years, and I had never even yelled or screamed at him, right? And I remember one day he did something to me, and I went left. I mean, when I say I went left, I went far left. I think I just went left, and it was just like, and cuss words coming out that I didn't even think I could say. I mean, I was going in. After I was calmed down, the situation was over. I couldn't admit to myself that I used that kind of language with him.
Wow.
I couldn't admit to myself that I had done that, because if I admitted it to myself, then I'm capable, right? Capable of it. So the only way that I could deal with it, though, is that I admitted it to myself. If you did call him this and this and this, and you said this about your loving, kind, wonderful, gentle husband, you went left. And so it is very hard. And that's why I asked the person who's sitting on the other side of infidelity is to recognize how difficult this is for the person to admit that.
Right.
So when I do counseling on infidelity, I counsel both sides. The person who has to be forgiven and the person who has to do the forgiving, because it's equally hard. How can I forgive you? How can I even ask for forgiveness? I don't even think that I did this. So I say you're dead on. It is hard to admit when any of us have had a failure in our character.
Wow. That's crazy. That I don't even think that I did this.
Yeah, we got to talk a little more about that. We're going to go to a quick break. You're listening to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show live in Mango's Caribbean Restaurant. We'll be right back. Well, all I ask is that you think.
Ladies, have you ever gone into a wig store looking for a new look and had to settle on something that wasn't quite you? Girl, stop. Don't ever do that again. Instead, go to braidedwigs.com and get wigs for us by us. Not only do they have full lace braided wigs, but dreadlock wigs. Girl, they even got kinky twist wigs. These wigs look so natural people won't believe it's a wig, even after you tell them. I mean, if you tell them. Young, older, in between. Braidedwigs.com. High quality, long lasting, original hand braided wigs shipped directly to your doorstep. Tell the Mental Dialogue sent you and receive a discount on your first wig. Braidedwigs.com. This is not your average wig company.
Authentic Caribbean food like jerk chicken, oxtail, red snapper, shrimp, tofu, and rasta pasta. You'll find your way over to Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Pico in downtown Atlanta. Mango's Caribbean Restaurant open daily from 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. and on Friday and Saturday we're open till 4 a.m. Come to Mango's and put some spice in your life. Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, 180 Auburn Avenue, right next to Royal Pico in downtown Atlanta. For more info or directions, call 404-698-3992 or log on to mangoscaribbeanrestaurant.com. For instant coupons, text MANGOS to 313131. Mango's Caribbean Restaurant, authentic Caribbean cuisines.
You exclusive? Got a big event? Need hair? But contact Exclusively Pure Hair for 100% authentic unprocessed virgin hair for the exclusive lady. 972-510-4403 or check out the website at www.exclusivelypurehair.com for the exclusive one.
The opportunity and wonder if I ever had a chance with you. Dance and dance with you. Hosting the
Welcome back to the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. I'm your host, Montoya Smith, a.k.a. Black Socrates, along with co-host Christy Gaynell, and we're fortunate enough to have in Dr. Monica Hill as we're discussing mental illness in the black community. How bad is it? And we've gotten into all type of things this morning. If you want to get in with us, please give us a call at 678-619-1623. Again, that number is 678-619-1623. This is our first Facebook Live show, so hopefully you're enjoying what you're seeing or hearing more or less. But I know we were talking about infidelity and things that you're seeing that are prevalent due to relationship wholeness, if I'm saying that correctly. And what y'all were talking about, that there's
that people have the inability to even acknowledge what they're doing to themselves, not let alone to their mate. So we were talking about how that sometimes creates this disconnect or cognitive dissonance within the person, where they can't even say, I am doing this, because it becomes an identity that they don't want to accept as a part of who they are.
Yeah, I think that happens. I think that happens. I think, in my personal opinion, that's happening more.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm talking about just generally speaking, and obviously not just in the infidelity area. Like I write about this all the time. Like, 'cause I like to write things or whatever, and I'm always like, in Mental Dialogue, I tell people, when you're coming to the event, we're learning what I call the art of consideration, because we're so divided on all these issues. We're so
you know what, though? That's an issue I do think social media is driving, because people are able to create these fantasies and these ideal images of who they want to be and who they project themselves to be, that it creates, again, they start believing the idea and the image more than the reality. And I think it's one of those things where we see where people are always posting like the highlights, the highlight film of their life, while they're suffering in silence inside, and we don't see that. So we see the 10% where everything looks great and happy and beautiful. We don't see the 90% where the tragedy is occurring, or the heartbreak is happening, or the depression is occurring. And I think every time we go out in public, then we feel this need to portray this image that we've created through social media, so that people can continue to see us that way, which then creates the need to continue to hide the mental illnesses or the mental health issues that are growing and building up inside of us, right?
And so I would like to go with that, because if we can agree that that's more prevalent in today's time, okay, and being a community that we can also admit we have these stigmas associated with even dealing with it. So how do we, as family members, get better? Because we talked about at the very beginning of the show, having personal issues that more than likely has touched a lot of families. I remember growing up in the South, historically, you have these situations where it just wouldn't be discussed. If even somebody having issues, you just never really talked about it. and you know, and it just kind of dealt with itself when it had to be. Or we have situations now with, I help with this one organization, Blankets of Love. We feed the homeless here in Atlanta every other Sunday or whatever. And I can tell you firsthand from doing that for the last 9 years. Again, this is just my generalized personal opinion, but a third of the people I see on the street have these mental health issues. And so my question now becomes, you know, in a sense, I wonder, do they end up on the street because their family had no idea, or there was some type of stigma associated with in learning how to help or help this person in your own family? So what are your recommendations from your standpoint if you're starting to see someone experience? It could be from childhood, it could be all kind of reasons, right? But what are your recommendations for dealing with someone that, or how to even maybe see the signs, or just what's your recommendations for us as families if we're going to get this thing back stronger? What are your recommendations to help somebody with it, especially if they're in their own denial?
So you talked about pretty much the whole gamut of mental health, right? So I'll start on the biochemical level. There are three main brain chemicals in our brain that causes kind of the baseline of our mental health, is our ability to be mentally healthy. About 25% of mental health diagnoses are in that category. There's something going wrong in the brain that you literally don't have mental health. And some of that's what you see on the street, the people who are walking around talking to themselves, just really disconnected, and those are what mental health institutions and things like that deal with. So you have that segment. About 25% of mental health diagnoses are in that category. The other 75% of mental health diagnoses are more or less not biochemical, but either trauma or relational or depression, anxiety, and those kind of things that are in that category. So we can talk about one of those. So if you've got someone in that first 25% of the category, that really needs medical treatment. That's where psychiatrists who are medical doctors with prescriptions and medications come in, and that's what you've got to rely on to help that. The other 75% as a psychologist is the area where I play. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist. And so a lot of that, you start going all the way back to childhood. When you start dealing with some of that 75%, you go back to childhood traumas, relationship disconnects, and that kind of thing. So then if you get someone you get back the onion to childhood and you kind of build up, then you say, okay, was the trauma so severe that this platform is just not stable? And so as a psychologist, I say those people need deep therapeutic treatment. That sometimes you just have to say that. Then you get to somebody who's kind of like, I'll say, a cold in mental health. It's a cold that is fairly easily treatable with, probably 6 months to a year's worth of psychology and treatment. So that's how I would break those three segments up. So in our community, as a family member, you almost have to recognize what you're dealing with, whether you have someone with biochemical issues, traumatic issues that going to need pretty much mid to long-term therapy, or you just dealing with somebody who's just got 12 to 18 months. You need to go see Dr. So-and-so and get yourself healthy.
So how do I see signs to say that? Because that's what we won't do. Like that's what I'm trying to kind of deal with here. So we got a stigma. So, because I, for example, having had this experience in my own life, not myself, but I'm just saying family member, to the extent that at that point, once there's been, in a sense, a quote unquote episode, so now the hospital or anybody that's treating her, they're giving you all these pamphlets to try to say, okay, this is how you deal with this now. Like you're forced to learn to deal with it because this is somebody that you care about, right? And so at that point, you're kind of taught how to empathize with it more, because you talked about empathy earlier.
I think you hit the nail right on the head. You go from the first place is that I'm considered crazy. In that first category, I'm crazy. Second category, we don't talk about it. If I have to go back to something in early childhood, got raped or molested, we don't talk about that. We keep all that quiet. Or I did some of the molestation, or we don't, in African American, we don't talk about those things, so I'm not going to let you diagnose it. And you may know, you see it playing out in some of the TV shows that, I think it's Greenleaf, is playing out that something happened to one of the girls in the show, and everybody knows the secret that somebody did something to Aunt so-and-so, and nobody wants to address it, right? So that's the thing, is we're not talking about it. And then the third level is we're just not educated to know which is which. Is it Uncle Pete? Is it biochemical? We don't know.
So when we're not talking about it, what's your suggestion? Like, here it is. If we know we're not talking, but let's try to figure out some idea to how we talk. Like the stigma is still more associated with we're not going to talk about it.
Right.
Like Uncle Pete, like you said, this Uncle Pete situation, and I've dealt with women who, like I'll give you a perfect example. Dealt with, and we talked about this when we did the Sex and Marriage show.
Right. Women who've
where
experienced
even their own mother,
Yeah.
because of protection of the family, or you didn't want this associated with your family,
Right.
found out there's something that happened to the. I mean, I've had a who say this. She says, "I told my mother, and it just kind of went away."
Right.
Now she was fortunate; it never happened again. Her situation wasn't a continued situation; it was a one-time situation.
Right.
But she's never forgot, and her and her mother are good, but she's never forgot that her hero chose a perception
Right.
over to protection
Absolutely.
of her own daughter. She's never forgot that, and she's good. She's, from what I can tell, she's mentally healthy and everything. But we had to talk about it because we were talking about sex and marriage on the other show. So if that's our stigma, and we say it all the time, but black people, we just don't talk about it. So as the professional, what do we say to our community so that our next generation is not coming up in a one in which they're scared to talk? We know, and especially when it's intentional, we know if it's an intentional situation,
Right.
that person is pretty much stigmatizing that child to say, you better not tell anybody, I'm gonna hurt somebody. So that's so to have a child answer what to do in that situation is absolutely difficult. But when you see families protecting that situation, how do we move out of that?
I say, and it goes back to what you said earlier, is if the person is not ever going to be ready to deal with the fact that I did that, or I let that happen to my child and I didn't address it, or even talking to Uncle Pete, right? So if those two categories of people are never going to talk about it, then that's what the professional mental health world is for. And you come as a person needing to evolve and get through that yourself. And then the mental health professional is absolutely trained and educated as to, it's about perspective. So what knowledge and experience did this person have, the reason why they didn't speak out and help you? Why didn't your hero speak up? And for you to get healthy enough to say, oh, you know what, I'm still hurting because they didn't, but now it helps a little bit better because I understand why.
Right.
It really helps. I think the understanding of that and working that out with a therapist really will get this person in a healthier place. They may be relationally healthy, but they're not individually healthy because they're still dealing with that, right? So my individual health can be dealt with and improved if I go and I talk to a mental health therapist to help me understand why is it that a person who loved me, my mother, would not address this when I was 10, 12.
Here's the thing I want to address, though. A lot of times, you're absolutely right. Understanding.
Actually, we got
Take
a
that call.
caller. Yeah, we're going to take the caller.
Hi, this is Maurice. I just wanted to share and ask a question. How do you help an individual who have history issues with their parents and they don't want to discuss that?
Let me have you repeat it. Want to have you repeat it, Maurice? Thanks for calling into the Minute Out Loud Talk Show, brother. When you said, how do you help? I want to make sure we get the question right for Dr. Hill. You said, how do you help someone who has relationships issues with their parents? And we missed the second half of the question. Oh, okay, got it. So the question is, make sure I think I understood it. They have relationship issues with their parents, but they don't want to discuss it. So he's saying, I guess from his position, how does he deal with that person since they don't want to discuss it? I think I'm hearing you.
Am I the parent or am I the person?
If Maurice, are we hearing you? You're in a relationship with the person who doesn't want to discuss it. Am I understanding you correctly, Maurice? Oh, he already got the phone. Okay, yeah. So his question was, he's in a relationship. Let's make you and me to make it simple. So he's saying you have relationship issues with your parents, but you don't want to discuss it. I'm in a position of trying to date you, but you don't want to talk about it. So he knows, I know you need to talk about it, but you don't want to. So he's trying to get some advice on what does he do? What do I do in this situation?
First of all, let me just acknowledge how great of a question that was. That's absolutely great because when you start dating someone, you're going to want to uncover things to make them more relationally healthy than they're going to want to deal with as their own individual health, right? So individually, I'm good with it. I'm past it. But relationally, I can't love you because of it. So excellent question. Good question. It's very delicate situation because what you're trying to do is to pull the scab off of this sore, and I don't want it there. It's scabbed up. It's healed. I've dealt with it. I don't pull it off, please, because then, and I will fight you to not pull this off. I will fight you. But what you're saying is I can't get close to you because it's still so tender. So,
that's a good one. That's a good question.
The first thing I think is to see is that if I don't want to pull the scab off of you and your parents, let's not even talk about that, because if you're good with that, I'm good with that. But let's start the communication of what it's doing to me and you. That's where we start. We start at the relational health, not so much as the individual health. I know it's individually unhealthy, but you put a scab over it and you're good with that. But because you've scalped it versus allowing it to heal, I can't touch you there. I maybe can't touch you physically because your father may have molested you, and if the relationship is important enough to person with the scalp on them, then that's how I begin to address it. I'm going to hide this hand from you because I'm not talking about Uncle Pete or my dad or my mom. We fought, and that's good. My daddy slapped me when I was 10, and I'm fine with that. I've forgiven him. I'm good. So what is that causing me and you? Why is that bothering you? It's because, baby, every time I go to touch you, you push back. And eventually, hopefully, you'll assess it. You will assess it back to that. But I can't make you. But we are going to talk about the fact that I can't hug you.
Right.
That makes sense. So, Maurice, I hope I'm pretty sure you're out there still watching this. But I just want to tell you what I understood, and I hope this helps him. But as you said, your address has to be just the issue that you understand, because like you said, your mate doesn't want to talk about that. In this situation, the family issues. So, if I heard you correctly, in this situation, Maurice, you need to continue to discuss the issue that it creates between you and your mate, but you're not going to be able to address that it's because of the parents, even though that person may know. But like you said, it's so tender to scab that it's probably causing your discussion to go even to the left, even more so. So I love that advice. But like you said, it's a very difficult question, and now I can use that for myself. No, or at least thinking about that in the future, because a lot of times we do like to deal with things head on. So I would be thinking in that same scenario, I'm thinking, well, Dr. Hill, I would say, Monica, you got to deal with this so we can be straight. Like, I'll be trying to keep pushing you towards, and you're basically saying, no, let's deal with what it creates for us. So that's very smart.
In a counseling session, I would ask you to be empathetic. You as the other person who don't have the issue, can you imagine what it must, because you're wanting the scab to be pulled off, right? But I would ask for empathy from you for a moment to understand what it's going to mean for them if they go back and pull it off. Not that we don't need to deal with it, but empathy here, let's deal relationally here, and the third piece is maybe one day they will. So 3 totally different things, and we've got to have empathy and our relationship issue on the table. But we may not ever be able to put issue 3 on the table with the scalp.
That's beautiful, because as I'm listening to you, the reality is, even earlier in the show when I said, unfortunately, bringing it back, kind of circling back to the African American community, that quite often I said, we're entering into relationships not as whole people.
Right.
More so in our community than others. At least that's what we were saying. I was saying that, and you agree with that. Right. But as I think about that, and the more I think about it, and this before the show, I've thought about this, but the reality is, even when we think we whole, because you kind of gave that situation between you and your husband, even when we kind of are relatively whole, we've had whatever we've overcome or dealt with our issues, so we're moving in, we're not bringing in baggage from another scenario. Whether we realize it or not, there's still issues that we may have or don't want to admit to, and all these type of things. So these things, absolutely can play out. And the empathy that you're talking about, I just want to I want to address it from the standpoint of that's another level of empathy.
Oh yeah.
Because we hear that word, and the average person, even if they're not empathetic, if you say you should be empathetic, they're going to say, oh yeah, you should be empathetic, even though they may not be in no kind of way, right? But the level of empathy, I just want to kind of peel that back even more, because the level of empathy that you just explained, and I'm kind of repeating what you're saying, but I think it needs to be.
Absolutely.
The scenario you just said is to be so empathetic to own, I love you enough to where we may never deal with it to the degree that you need to. But like you said, in counseling, you're explaining, you putting you and I in that situation to me, that I have to be so empathetic to say, okay, I understand why that person wouldn't deal with it. And it changes how you would deal with that person.
Right.
So that's just a whole nother level of empathy, and I just want to make sure that's not missed.
So let me break empathy down, because I'm glad you said that, because we do overuse that word without spelling it out. So there are 4 levels to empathy, if you will. First of all, can you hear what I'm saying? Can you hear, babe, that's bothering me? Can I hear you? Can I see that? I hear you. I'll use testosterone because that's the one I use. Maurice said, can you hear what I'm saying? That it's not good enough for us to be intimate once a month. Can you hear me? And I'm like, I don't care about that. So, okay, let me lean in. I think I hear you when you're saying it's not good, right? I lean in, I hear that. Can you see what I'm saying? I've got to put it back into that person's mental map. And what the way that this happened for me is I put hunger. Can you see what I'm saying? That it's not good for me to come to this table week after week hungry, and you make a choice not to feed me. Can you see that? And I couldn't see testosterone, but I could see hunger. I could see food. I'm hungry today. You've got the food to feed me, and you choose not to give me that food.
Wow.
Can you see that? And it's like, oh, so the person has to be good enough to explain it in a way that my mental map reads it. So can you hear me? Will you lean in? Can you see it? And then here's the biggie. Can you feel that?
Right.
This is where the empathy definition really comes into play, is can you feel what it must be like wanting to love you, knowing that this scab is between us and I can't love you? Can you feel what that's like for me? And if you can feel what that is like for me, and here's the other bigger one, if you love me enough, you choose not to leave me in that condition. So that's what the 4 levels of empathy is about, is if, and sometimes we find out, I don't care, I see you, I hear you, I feel you.
I just don't love you enough.
I just don't love you enough to move you off that mountain. You stick right there on that mountain. Then I go back because you cheated on me in 1972.
Right.
So empathy just goes deeper and deeper, and it peels back the onion. But it's a way to get to the core.
So
I wanted to comment on something before we get too far away from it that you were talking about earlier, and that was dealing with relationships between victim and the people that surrounded the incident, and then the victimizer. And one of the things we were talking about was having an understanding for, like, say if my mother knew about something and didn't do anything about it, and having that understanding of why she didn't do anything about it. It might be something in her history that she hasn't dealt with herself yet, or whatever the case may be. But one of the things we often don't talk about that you mentioned was the need for the victimizer to have a mental health check, or to have counseling, or to have therapy, because we're always, kind of accusing them of being, this horrible person. I think they get more of a stigma attached to them than any other person living, but we don't recognize the mental health issues that they have a lot of times that led them to do this thing in the first place. So we look at the, say if it's a rape victim, we look at the rape victim, oh my gosh, you poor thing, you've been raped. But what happened in the rapist's mind that made them feel the need to commit this act in the first place is something that I don't think we ever kind of address. And I want to know, as a counselor, have you ever encountered somebody who was, like the rapist or the molester, or that person come to you saying, I need help? How do we get those people to get help, and what do you do, when you're faced with that?
You guys are digging underneath some pretty good stuff, and we're taking, this question will take mental health to I'll say the far left. There is a psychological disorder called RAD. It's reactive attachment disorder. It is where someone is so callous that they don't feel any pain or anger or anything from abusing someone. It's reactive attachment disorder. That person themselves were so abused that they have absolutely emotionally been removed from human emotion. I can cut you up, slice you up, put you in a sandwich bag, and go to dinner. That's a person who's at that far left. So if the rapist has some degree of that area that they've been so abused or neglected or abused that they've been kind of removed from some emotional connection with other human beings, then that may be what you have. They can rape you, molest you, but that's usually the really people that will rape you and kill you. That's not Uncle Pete.
Right.
So then you come from the left a little bit more to where people culturally have said, this is what we do to cousins. Cousin did it to cousin, and cousin, this is what, grandpa looking up under the bed. This is culturally what we did to people. So this new child coming into this family as a 13 or 14-year-old child doesn't know that culture. They just got introduced to the culture. This is what we do. And mama says we don't say anything about it. Because maybe that is historically what they did. And I do believe to some degree families have generational curses. Like in mine, my brothers were a little bit womanizers. My dad was a womanizer. In some families, it may be alcoholism. Maybe it's incest. This becomes a cultural norm for this family, and this child at 14 or 15 just got introduced to the family culture, and mom has seen it. She's been introduced to it. She's not saying anything. And I'm not saying this is always the case, because there is many people who would ask this question would be as many different scenarios as to how this led to this behavior. But for the victim to understand why the protector did not do anything, it could go from a mental disorder, RAD, or some varying degree of that, cultural dynamics of what mom accepted or have seen in the family, and she was taught, hush, hush, don't say anything, to now, how do I deal with this, and how do I, so it's the mental health of the first time introduced person to this thing that really just has to go. And mom, because she never dealt with the culture she was in, she can't take it, because she now has to bear the weight that, mom, you should have done something. This 13 saying you should have done something. And mom cannot bear that weight because grandma didn't do anything, or Aunt Susan didn't do anything for her. And maybe she should have, and she wasn't strong enough. Or maybe she stayed with dad because, you know, he was a financial provider in 1970s. We did that because we couldn't survive as women on our own. So it's a very, very, very difficult situation for the 13-year-old now adult person to deal with, that mom didn't do anything. But it absolutely is why mental health is a profession. You have to be licensed to do it. It's not something you can casually do.
What about Uncle Pete? Like, what do we do about Uncle Pete? You know, who maybe doesn't have RAD, but still thinks that it's okay to molest his niece or nephew or cousin or whoever the case may be. And how do we, you know, take this from being Uncle Pete's just a pervert to Uncle Pete needs some help?
I believe it's the Uncle Pete's of the world that never come into therapy, because if I think about, as you was asking the question, I was thinking about the people that I normally treat. It's the mom or the person who should have been the protector and the victim. The Uncle Pete's very seldom sit in my office and say, I am the molester. I wished I had done something. They very seldom, because I do believe, and I'll use a biblical example, it's the weight of what Jesus, the person who turned Jesus in, I'm just drawing such a blank. Judas. It's the, what did Judas do to himself? He flung himself over a cliff and killed himself. When I have to bear that burden, it's such a burden to bear for most people that I never bear it. And nobody's going to drag you in kicking and scratching into a therapist's office, so you never go. I think it is a tremendous weight that they have to deal with. But those who want to deal with that burden, I would say to them that mental health professional and the kindness, we are a helping professional. We're not an accusing profession. We would never make anyone who would want to come and deal with that feel guilty or anything like that. It is for your mental health, and we are health professionals. We are there to make you more healthy. So I don't think they realize that, though.
Because, like you said, a lot of times it is a cultural thing that's passed down from generation to generation. And Uncle Pete may be that way because he saw his uncle before him doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, at a certain point, where do we break this side of the cycle from the, it's not okay for you to, you know, touch your cousins inappropriately or molest your whoever the case may be. And like you said, those people don't often come in because it is a stigma attached to being that person. And I think also there is that cognitive dissonance where they don't want to even acknowledge that they are that person. Uncle Pete very rarely says, you know, yeah, I'm a molester. He says, you know, come give Uncle Pete some love.
I think we do it just like what you guys are doing today. I think we start by doing it in a group forum, so Uncle Pete himself don't have to be identified. He's not going to come in on a one-on-one. But if we start talking about it in group forums, if there are any Uncle Pete's in the audience, they will know that there is help for them, and maybe they'll start coming in. I think you guys are onto something with this forum, is that we've got to start talking about the tough questions in forums like this, that Uncle Pete doesn't have to raise his hand, but he's getting the help that he needs.
Well, I ask, too, because a lot of times what we overlook in that situation is that Uncle Pete was also abused. Uncle Pete usually suffered some form of abuse growing up, that he did not know how to deal with that other than to continue the pattern. And so we don't look at the backstory, we look at the front story, which is now you're the victimizer instead of also the victim.
Either there's usually one of two things. It's either that, or then Uncle Pete chose that as his drug of choice to deal with something else. Either he was directly abused himself, or he chose abuse as a way of dealing with self-medicating. Maybe, say if his father beat him, then now he's using the controlling, like I'm going to control, now I'm going to control, and I'm going to take control over something I couldn't take control over with my dad who beat me. They become some other manifestation of that. So it's usually one of the two, either direct or indirect. But I think, yeah, it's the group forums that probably would be the first step.
So we only have so many minutes left, but, you know, as I listen, you know, great stuff, Christy. Definitely a perspective that's not talked about enough. In the last couple of minutes, if just generally speaking, again, just trying to bring it to our community as a whole. Just want to think of it on that level, and we didn't get too deep into Dr. DeGraw's work or whatever as far as the traumas that seemingly continue to pass down for some of the reasons that we talk about. Some things become cultural, and so it's one thing you said earlier was when you said as families, it would be smart for us to have psychologists just as we have a family health doctor. So that's one solution that I've heard specifically that we should, in a sense, be more open to. Now, if everybody that listens says, you know what, I'm going to take that advice from my family. The education portion is still, well, I still don't know when I should use it to a certain extent because as you mentioned earlier, we don't have the education to describe these scenarios. So I can see something happening with my kid that's always been happening, but we don't know to say, well, this is the time that we take them to the psychologist at a younger age because we're scared of that, we're afraid of that, or we talked about in the schools the misdiagnosis. So there's still so much trauma, so much misinformation that's associated with us even being smart about using the profession more. I mean, obviously, I'm very thankful that to have you, and as you said, you're seeing an evolution with the men because, as you just mentioned, just the fact that they can see somebody who looks like them. These things matter, specifically in America, where race is such a big part of this country, whether you want to believe it or not. So there's, in my opinion, this is a bigger and more important issue in our community. Because we're still, with everything that we said, we didn't even talk about what we deal with from a racism standpoint. Like I see arguments get made all the time on other issues that we talk about that as a community, generally speaking, we deal with racism too much. Like we think about it too much. And then some say, well, if we thought about it less, we could progress forward. So there's this whole gamut of how much we should be dealing with it. So I guess in these last few minutes, if I could just kind of ask you, what type of experiences that are you seeing from your, one, you've stepped in to make a difference from an individual standpoint, right. But what things, from your perspective, I don't know if I'm making sense, but just, okay, go ahead.
So let me use these. These are the three signs you use: your feelings, your thinking, and your talking. If you're feeling angry, anxiety, distressed, upset often enough, if you're feeling this, right, then that's a sign you should go. If you are thinking things, just say if I'm, you and I are in a relationship and I'm just thinking about this, he make me sick, I can't stand him, he get on my nerves. I'm not talking about it, and I'm trying to suppress my feelings, but I'm thinking about it all the time, like So what I think about most often, and I can't shake it, go. The other thing is if I'm talking to, every time I'm on the phone, I'm talking to them about my marriage. Every time I'm talking about, if I'm talking about it, thinking about it, or having feelings about it often enough, those are the steps, progressive steps, that I think you need to go get a check-in.
Are there times when you think, well, you did mention that you think that, like with divorce, people should automatically, send their kids to therapy. And I think a lot of times, like even with me, I thought about it. I never did send my kids to any type of counseling or therapy after our divorce. I kind of still think I should have, but it was
thinking about it, thinking, right?
But it's one of those things where I asked the kids, "Do you want to go?" And they were like, "No." So I kind of just took them at, they said they don't want to go. I gave them an option, and I, allowed myself to be dismissive of that instead of kind of maybe like if they had a broken leg and they're like, "No, I don't want to go to the doctor. I'm going to take them anyway." I don't know if
and they don't know what you're asking. They don't have a, just like we as adults don't have a clue. The statement I hear more often than anything, I never knew counseling was going to be like this. I didn't know what to expect. Because we've never seen a movie, we don't know. You say you want to go see a movie? What's a movie? They don't even have a mental map to map therapy around. It's not even talked about on shows, so they had no clue what you were talking about when you say, do you want to go talk to someone? Talk to somebody about what? No, I don't want to go see a movie. I've never seen one. So they don't know, and it's the same thing that I see a lot of men, typically, honestly, that says, and they're so thankful that they came, but they didn't even know what to expect.
Yeah, I love that term. The more you said it throughout the show, the mental map. And again, because I do a discussion group, I'm always trying to bridge that gap on how to listen and how to consider consider from other perspectives. It's actually something I learned from reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he was just, because he was talking about in a debate, he always try to understand the other side better so he could do better for his side. But, like you say, this idea of a mental map, we're not really thinking, they don't know all our words.
Right.
Because we just make some assumptions. Like, every word you said to your child, you know they know that word. But when they're put together that way,
They don't have a clue.
they have no clue what getting counseling or whatever. So I respect that you're saying, as you listen to her, you're kind of like, dang, I might have should have did something different. Like I said, the thinking about it. That's beautiful. To even have that. And then in the last, we only got a few more minutes, but something else that quite happens now, you were breaking down the 3 different areas when it comes to mental health, which is now we're talking about the psychiatrist. That's when you start getting into the medications. So here's something else that happened, like, for example, with my mother. My mother has anxiety, kind of had it most of her life, right? So eventually got placed on certain pills to help dealing with the anxiety. And we went through a couple periods and episodes where even in her mind, she got to the point where I'm getting dependent. And some of it is medicine that can make you dependent, right?
Absolutely.
So it wasn't that she was incorrect,
No,
but she was decided, I don't want to be dependent. So then she started personally trying to medicate, not based on the prescription, but kind of like, I'm going to do less. Because some stuff, when it comes to certain aspects of mental health,
stress.
Well, just the idea of some stuff, you kind of get told where you do it as you need. So everything's, you're not at a stage where you're required to take it every day. Some, certain issues that you have, it's different levels to it. So, but it's not just my mother. I've had this happen with friends where they're so against being dependent. But the reason they're so against it, not only just for themselves, but because of stigmas in our own community.
Yeah,
like that plays a role, not just them thinking, well, I don't want to be dependent. I don't want people thinking of me this way because I've gotten dependent. Because there are stigmas in our community about being on these things or whatever. And so I've had not just my mother, but a good friend of mine who would take it less. And so we literally had to convince her, like, don't go against with the thing. You're at a point now where you need this. Now, what I would have loved is to been counseling before she got to that point. That's why, if we take your advice, if we consider having a psychologist as regularly as we have a family health doctor, then we can avoid getting to the stage where now you do need pills. You've had an episode. You've not dealt with this so long. You've acted out. Now everybody knows. Now that person's living with the embarrassment of, I just did something. I was out of my mind. I didn't even know I did that. I didn't even plan to do that because hiding something, holding something, not talking about it. So again, I'm just kind of reiterating, like, this is what I've learned as we listen. Like, the stuff you're saying is so important, and I'm just trying to put it in a perspective that hopefully anybody that's watching will take some of this advice and say, you know what, and act on it, because we're just kind of floating in this continued situation where we're the most undiagnosed. Now we have people in situations where now they need pills. And not that needing a pill by itself, but we do have a stigma with that, and it's sad. Again, I'm just kind of rambling or whatever. But Christy, if you want to jump in or whatever, but I'm just so thankful for for this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. It's not even just needing pills. It's the fear of hospitalization and the stigmas attached to that. I had one person tell me that, I was like, you probably should get some mental help. You probably could even get a check, for your mental illness if you were to go get diagnosed, because it's ex-military. And the person was like, I don't want to be diagnosed because then I can't carry a gun, and I want my rights. I don't want my rights stripped away because I'm diagnosed with an illness. And so there's depending on, I guess, where you're coming from, there's various levels and reasons why people don't want to be diagnosed with something. But is it possible in those situations to get counseling or get assistance without getting diagnosed?
Oh, absolutely. I don't necessarily, because in the first 3 months of treating someone, the first couple of sessions, I don't have to diagnose you with anything. There's a code that I use that you're in treatment. Right now, I have several sessions. Just like if you go to a medical doctor, he doesn't give you a diagnosis. He runs an MRI. He does all kind of testing. He's doing a KMG or whatever. He's doing all kinds of testing. Then once he do all the tests, then he says you have stage 4 cancer. So he doesn't have to have a diagnosis code. He has treatment codes and analysis codes that they use. So that's what the same thing with mental health. I don't have to diagnose you the first time you come in. I actually am analyzing you to make sure I give you the proper diagnosis.
But once the diagnosis is made, I think that's where the fear comes in, because most people, they're not scared as much of the treatment. They're afraid of the diagnosis, because the stigma lies with the diagnosis, with the attachment that now I am labeled as this thing. And I think a lot of people fear that label, and so they
think
fear
of it this way:
getting
if you
the
go
treatment.
to the doctor and I'm doing treatment, and I said you have a cold, There are diagnosis codes that are all the way on this end and all the way on this end, to the left and to the right. So if you come and you find out you just have stress on your job, I'm sure I'm diagnosing you with a little bit of stress. You don't have anxiety, you don't have PTSD, you don't have RAD. So I think you're exactly right. Is some of these lower leveling diagnoses we shouldn't be afraid of. It's just like a cold. You know, and I don't know what's wrong with me. My chest keeps hurting. Now, I don't want to go to the doctor and find out I got cancer, but I don't mind going to the doctor if he's going to tell me I got a little bronchitis that is treatable. So that's the thing we have to evolve in, that we should be okay with some of these lower level things that are treatable. But you're right. Nobody wants to go to the doctor and hear I have stage 4 cancer.
Right.
And at the end of the day, if you have that, you need to be diagnosed. So yeah,
you
can't run from the. And we got plenty of people who are I've had, especially in our community, they'll say, I don't want to know. So they just don't go to the doctor. I'm talking about even if they're experiencing, you know what I mean? So at the end of the day, that's where we're at. But it's been an amazing show for me. Again, first time on Facebook Live. I'm definitely, again, thankful to Mango's Caribbean Restaurant and for allowing us to come in and do our first Facebook Live show. How did we do, Christy? I'm still getting adjusted
really
to the video.
It. I think we did excellent, and I appreciate you, Miss Hill, for being here. Dr. Hill, my bad. Dr. Hill.
And so, Dr. Hill, if you will, in closing, if there's any way to let people get in contact with you, if they want to, maybe, I know you have a lot of options for people to. So if you can give that information out, and as also if you'll send me a message, I'll put it up on the Mental Dialogue Facebook page as well.
Good.
So if you will, just give people your information.
All right. So Hill and Associates is a corporation that we have 7 lines of business that we actually do. The counseling piece is just one piece of it. I'm actually a licensed life coach. I could also do life coaching if you don't want something in the mental health. We do webinars and training, online support that we do. We do speaking and training engagements where I will come and speak and, to your organization or wherever. We have 2 pieces of our organization that are evolving. We will eventually get to where we're doing a talk show, and a radio show is my biggest dream, for it to be Dr. Hill Live and a talk show, a radio show. And then the other thing is we'll have the Counseling Cafe, where we'll have kind of a social environment where you can come and socialize and sit down and talk at a table, have a cup of coffee and that kind of thing. So we have several different things, and our website is Hill, Hill, the letter N, associates.com. So visit our website, and all of the services that we provide are actually listed on the website.
Okay, we will post that website to the Mental Dialogue Facebook page. Christy, as always, thank you, and Dr. Hill, you've been amazing. Thank you for coming on. And if you are in the Atlanta area, the Mental Dialogue live experience every 3rd Friday at Urban Grind. Please come check us out on December 16th. Go to the Mental Dialogue Facebook page, and you'll also see the advertisement for that. But we're going to have our end of year special. It's going to be nothing like it. We're doing soapbox dialogues. We'll see y'all next Saturday. We'll be back to Blog Talk Radio. I'm getting used to this video thing. I don't know if I like it yet, but anyway, it's all good. Appreciate y'all for tuning in today. We'll be back next Saturday on the Blog Talk Radio station for Mental Dialogue at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. All I ask is that you think.